Howdy folks, I'm Keith Bowen and this is Hard Rock University. Now today's lesson is specifically directed at Nikunj in Tanzania, who has a milling process where they're doing cyanide vat leaching. This would also apply to a lot of other leaching scenarios, so it's also a general lesson on principles. I'm not able to go over there. I can't get any real specific and volume of information, so I have to keep it kind of general anyhow, so it'll be a great lesson for everybody. Now, first of all, let's take a look at the situation they have over there. Here's some of the ore that they have. It's obviously a quartz with some copper in it. And they take this material and they run it through a jaw crusher, an impact mill, and a dry ball mill to create the crushed ore. I don't know what the particle size distribution is of the crushed ore. Okay? It looks like sand. That's all I can tell from the pictures and such. However, from that point there, they take it to the processing area where they have these cylindrical concrete tanks in the ground, which again I would call a vat because there's no agitation going on. They take these tanks and they build a false bottom in them with cinder blocks, gravel, and topped with burlap that creates a filter out of the bottom of the tank, and then it goes through a pipe at that point. The material is loaded into the tanks by hand. It's shoveled in dry. They mix lime with it at the time to adjust the pH for the cyanide, which is a very good way of doing it. Then once it's all loaded in, they add the cyanide solution. They let it soak for 36 to 48 hours. Then they start circulating the cyanide solution through carbon. Now, we would normally do it like a fluidized bed carbon column. Here it's a little less technological, but it still works. They just flow it through the carbon, as you can see right there. Later they take the loaded carbon and have it stripped. The solution that goes through the carbon is then recycled back into the tanks, and they keep doing this for 6 or 7 days. During this process, they periodically test the pH and the cyanide, keep those fairly stable, pH of 10 to 12. They didn't specifically say what the cyanide was. I get the impression that Nikunj is more the owner, manager, and there's a chemist who does this stuff and has the technical expertise on that end of it. But anyhow, it's kept within the operating parameters that they think are acceptable. And they keep testing for dissolved gold. At least that's the what they say. Now I'm trying to understand, there's a language barrier again, exactly what they're testing for and how they're testing it to determine the amount of dissolved gold in solution. It's apparently some kind of precipitation test or something, and it may be precipitating total solids. The terms black, gray, and white may mean like dark, not so dark, and clear. I don't know. So I'm trying to ascertain exactly what that process is to determine what it's really able to tell. Don't know. Anyhow, they keep leaching it about 6 to 7 days while testing for these dissolved solids, presumably gold. And then when it gets below a certain level, they stop the leaching, drain the solution, unload the tank, and load some more ore in it. And they keep doing this through one of the seasons, and then on a different season, I believe it was during the wet season, they can't get any more ore, and I presume transportation's impossible. So then they will re-leach the material that they have leached one time. So that's kind of the setup that they've got in terms of assaying. I have one assay sheet that's done from an actual laboratory. They often will take 80 to 90 kilogram samples over to the locals who will sluice it over like a corduroy table sort of thing, and then pan it down and actually recover gold. They report roughly about 0.4 of a gram for an 85 kilogram sample. Works out, if I'm not mistaken, about 4.7 parts per million, about 0.15 ounces per ton, or about $200 a ton. This would be hard to do profitably on a small scale in the United States, what with the labor costs and the permitting costs, but over there things are a lot cheaper in some ways. So that's what they have, and the first thing that I would suggest is to try and develop a good way of some ore grade control. Be able to test the ore, know exactly what it is, or at least as close as possible. One thing you could do is right here where the crushed ore comes out of the ball mill, there's something called a disc sampler. It's basically a very slow moving disc. It rotates, like once every half hour or hour. And one side of it is in the process stream. As this stuff would come out of the ball mill, it would glance on one side of the disc, and most of it would just fall right off. As the disc turns, more space becomes available and new stuff gets collected. As it rotates, there's a scraper that pulls the material that's on the disc off, and that becomes your sample. And it can sample at low percentages of the process stream fairly effectively and uniformly, and then you take that and you can split it further down and deal with it. For your leached materials, you're going to have to cone and quarter. I mean, every 10th shovelful you throw a different place, then you cone and quarter that. Something to that effect to get a good idea of what the final recovery rate is. And that way you have some sort of good idea of what the heck is going on. Without that, you can't really tell how well things are working. Now, another thing that can be very helpful is to do smaller batches. Instead of 50-ton batches, do something a little more, a little easier to handle for a test. I mean, you could take like a 55-gallon drum, run a sample in a 55-gallon drum, try different things and see what happens. But the next suggestion I would have is doing at least a test of a gravity extraction first. Now, since they're doing these, as I'll call them corduroy tables, these sluice boxes, and getting good recoveries, then there's a certain amount of gold that can be recovered by gravity. And here's why teaming a gravity system with the cyanide system or any other leaching can sometimes make it much more efficient. Back to the whiteboard. Okay, here I have kind of a graph. This would be if you had like a whole bunch of gold particles sorted by size. Small particles, larger, 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 and larger. And you had about equal amounts of each size particle. Now that's an idealized situation, unlikely to actually happen in real life. But it makes for a simple graph. The principle remains the same. Now, if you have a simple gravity extraction, it's going to get some of this gold here. Okay? It's going to get more of the big gold, less of the small gold. A decent gravity extraction, I'm estimating this line here, almost 100% of the coarser gold, and then it reaches a point here where you're just not recovering anything anymore. It's just floating off on you. If you work really hard and get a better system, you may get to this dashed line here. But everything below this line is going to be lost. And as you can see, that's a lot of gold. This is roughly a 50% line here. When you're leaching, especially with cyanide or one of the slower leaches, then the coarser particles are going to get almost no recovery whatsoever. They're very, you're just not going to get into them very much. So this kind of represents the leaching ability. Now there's probably some overlap here, but that would mess up with something else I'm going to show you. So, you can't get over 100%. But here, the smaller particles, and this assumes that you have mineral liberation, where every particle can theoretically be either leached or recovered by gravity. Okay? Both will work. Now, in the leaching scenario, the smaller particles, you get essentially 100% recovery, and then as they get bigger, they get harder and harder to dissolve. This would also be if you didn't have complete liberation or something. So, what happens if you use both? Well, if you use a fairly rough gravity scenario, you're going to get this amount of gold. And then if you leach it, you get this amount of gold, and all you lose is this little bit in here. So, in a situation where you have a significant amount of larger size gold, large enough to be difficult to leach in the time frames you can leach, there's always a time limit, then a gravity separation may make sense. On the other hand, if you have a situation where you got a lot of fine gold, but you can't get with gravity, then you may want to add a leaching circuit. If you have nothing but fine gold, as they typically do in heap leaches, there's an insignificant quantity of coarser gold, then all you do is leach. But this is a scenario where you have both. You will not know what you have until you test it. All ores are different. Some may be mostly coarse, some may be mostly fine. Most are going to be some kind of a mixture of the two, but the coarse may be an insignificant amount of gold. So, that's why using both a gravity and a leaching circuit together can give you dramatically better recoveries than either one by itself. Okay, so that's why you would consider doing it. You're going to need to run some tests. The gravity system doesn't have to be super efficient, so a simple sluice box may be perfectly adequate in this case because you don't need to get the real fine gold. That's going to leach just fine. So instead of like an expensive shaker table, you might just be able to do a simple sluice box or a jig or something like that. Just scalp those coarser particles first. You have to test and see what actually works. I'd go with the sluice first just because it's so cheap and it's something they can build themselves. It's not technology you have to buy. They make all kinds of concentrators, centrifugal concentrators, etc. And generally your prices are on the order of $20,000, $30,000 each. So if you can get by with a $500 sluice box and you're still going to leach it anyway, hey, there you go. Makes it simple. Now, the other thing you do in a test, screen it to different sizes. I don't know what your particle sizes are. Screen it like 30 mesh plus and minus, stuff like that. See how much of the coarser particles you have and have those tested. See how much gold is in them. You can have it assayed. You could finally pulverize it and test it again. Things like this. But there's ways of testing to see how much free gold you have, how much leachable gold you have, and how much residual gold you would have at various particle sizes. And see, do you have a substantial amount of material where just the rock particles are so big that you can't get the gold out of them in a reasonable leach time. If so, when you're doing your gravity separation, you can also put a screening operation in there and send the larger material back to be reground before you go to leaching. In the actual leaching, dry piling it in there shovelful by shovelful is a pretty good way to avoid coarse and fine particle bedding. Like if you're doing it with a conveyor, the coarser particles tend to flow to the bottom and you can wind up with channeling. Shovel by shovel, not so much. If you've done say a sluicing first and then let it drain, now you're shoveling it in damp and the finer particles stick to the coarser particles, and it should be pretty good. Not too much channeling if you've got a good fine grind. Make sure that when you're recirculating the leaching solution through the carbon, that you get good aeration. Make sure that, like as you're dumping it into the tank, that it hits a number of barriers and gets lots of bubbles and airs in it, so that you can make sure you have good aeration. Oxygen is very important to a cyanide leach. No oxygen, no leaching. So you want to make sure you have good aeration. And then when you're done leaching, sample that too and see what you have left in those tailings. If you do all of that, you should be able to tell whether or not you're getting a good result, and if you're not, why you're not. But those are the things that I would look at first. First of all, you need a good sampling system and a good assaying system just to find out what the heck is going on in the first place. Check out your particle sizes. How far do you have to grind it to get good recoveries, and are you achieving that? If not, screening it and regrinding the oversize may give you a significant improvement. Run a gravity separation before the leach so that the coarser gold particles are taken out before you even get to the leaching operation. Generally, keep that cheap, because anything that's really, really fine, you're going to get with the leaching. You're just trying to get the bigger, chunkier stuff. And if that makes up a significant part of your total gold, then that's going to be a significant loss if all you're doing is cyanide leaching, especially without agitation and such. And I say then just test. Another thing too, concrete tanks can leak, they can develop cracks, they can separate where the pipe comes out, things like that. So towards the end of that first soak cycle, where the ore should be thoroughly wetted, the solution level in the tank should remain very stable. There's going to be some evaporation, but except for that, when you're not adding any solution, you're not taking any out, it should just stay right there. If it's going down, you're going to be losing solution somewhere. That's going to be costly, and you are likely to be polluting the groundwater, although cyanide is not stable in normal pHs, so it will probably break down. But that could create hydrogen cyanide gas, which is not a good thing. So make sure there's no leaks in the system too. That should be fairly easy to figure out if you have significant leaks. The cyanide should be in the neighborhood of 0.025 to 0.05% in solution. Too much will also slow things down. It's more expensive, and it doesn't work it actually works worse. So that's about, in Tanzanian units, call it 1/4 to 1/2 kilo per 1,000 liters of solution. pH of 10 to 12, that should be just fine. You're neutralizing the ore as you're stacking it, that should be just fine. Those would be my suggestions at this point. Sample it, check your particle sizes, see if you need to screen and regrind. Test how well a gravity separation combined with the leaching works, and test your tailings to see where things are going. Check for leaks and keep your cyanide in the right range. So that would be the suggestions. It would apply to any leaching operation, whether you were tank leaching, using a thiourea or whatever. Generally, thiourea is going to get the big stuff. But are you sure? Would it be simpler to put in a gravity first? It depends. Try it out and see what happens. See whether or not it'll pay for itself and make sense. I know of one decent size tank leaching operation where they had a problem with a launder plugging up with sludge. That sludge was 25% gold that was just not getting captured. As a matter of fact, there was a couple of guys at the mill that did not mind cleaning out that nasty, icky mud. They didn't have a problem at all doing that job. Metallurgist figured out why. Currently, Nikunj reports they're getting about 65% recovery in their first leaching cycle. I think there's a good chance we might be able to increase that by 15 or 20%. Certainly, multiple leaching cycles will help, but there's only so much you can do if it's either not liberated, not exposed, or just too darn big. So that's the advice I have for you, Nikunj. After the credits, I'm going to put the information back on there in writing, because I know there's a translation issue going on. So I'm going to put it in print so that you can look at it. So that's basically for Nikunj to, after the credits, when it rolls, I'll go through the list of things again, but I'll put it all in writing for you. And I also want to give special thanks to Chris Ralph. He's much more knowledgeable about these things than I am. He's actually been to Africa a few times and such. And he regularly writes articles for the International California Mining Journal and such. So I ran this information past him, got his input to see if there's anything I was missing, and things like the cyanide concentrations and stuff. It's been a long time since I've used cyanide, so he was able to help me with all that. So I want to thank Chris for his help. He was just volunteering his time and everything, and I really appreciate that. And Nikunj, if you could please, as you try things or whatever, just let me know how things work out. I'm sure that a lot of people here would be kind of interested to see a follow-up and see what happened. But that's basically what I have for you right now. If you have any questions or whatever, get a hold of me. Happy prospecting, and keep it safe out there.